In Rome, there is a hill that looks completely ordinary until you learn what it is made of. Monte Testaccio is not earth or stone. It is a 35-meter-high mountain built from the shattered remains of roughly 53 million clay jars. For about 120 years, those jars carried one thing into Rome: olive oil. So how did oil pressed from a small fruit become important enough for an empire to literally build a mountain from its packaging? To answer that, we have to go back about 8,000 years. At Kfar Samir, a Neolithic village now submerged off the coast of modern Israel, archaeologists found some of the earliest known evidence of olive oil production. People crushed wild olives with simple stone tools, collected the oil separating from the pulp, and stored it in clay vessels. They had not yet learned to cultivate olive trees on a large scale. They were harvesting trees that had existed long before humans arrived. Fossilized olive leaves found in the Mediterranean date back tens of thousands, even millions, of years. The olive tree was ancient. Humanity's breakthrough was discovering what could be extracted from it. The real transformation came on Crete. By around 1700 BCE, the Minoans were no longer simply pressing olives for local use. Palace records show olive oil being tracked, stored, and traded across the Aegean. It was used for food, medicine, cosmetics, religious rituals, and commerce. For the first time, olive oil became more than a useful liquid. It became part of an organized economy, and some of the trees planted in Crete would outlive the civilization that depended on them. When classical Greece rose, olive oil became more than an economic product. It became part of identity. According to myth, Athens itself was won by Athena after she gifted the city an olive tree. The story was symbolic, but the protection was real. In the 6th century BCE, sacred olive trees were treated as state property. Damaging them could bring severe punishment, and laws limited how many trees could be cut. The reason was practical. Olive oil was one of Athens's most valuable exports. The city placed olive branches on coins, crowned victors with olive wreaths, and turned the tree into a symbol of prosperity, protection, and civic power. No one understood the value of the olive tree better than Solon. In the 6th century BCE, the Athenian lawmaker placed strict protections on sacred olive trees. Inspectors monitored the groves. Only a small number of trees could be cut, and severe penalties could follow their destruction. But this was not simply religious devotion. Olive oil was one of Athens's most important agricultural exports. Solon restricted the export of other farm products, while allowing olive oil to move abroad, helping turn it into a premium commodity. Athens was protecting more than a tree. It was protecting one of the foundations of its economy. In ancient Greece, olive oil also became a prize. At the Panathenaic Games in Athens, winners received large painted amphorae filled with oil from Athena's sacred groves. The best athletes could take home dozens of jars, worth roughly years of a skilled worker's wages. Before competing, athletes rubbed olive oil over their bodies for warmth, protection, and grip control. To the Greeks, olive oil was not just food, it was wealth, strength, and prestige. For Greek athletes, olive oil was part of the body itself. Before competition, they rubbed it over their skin to warm the muscles, protect against sun and dust, and make themselves harder to grip in wrestling. Afterward, they scraped away the oil, sweat, and dirt with a curved bronze tool called a strigil. But the strangest part came next. That mixture was sometimes collected and sold. People believed oil taken from the body of a champion carried medicinal power, and perhaps even some of the athlete's strength. To the Greeks, olive oil could carry more than wealth. It could carry vitality. Olive oil soon moved far beyond Greece. As Greek colonies spread across Sicily, southern France, and Spain, olive trees traveled with them. But the Phoenicians pushed the trade even farther, carrying oil along maritime routes across North Africa and the western Mediterranean. They did more than sell it. They helped spread the knowledge of how to cultivate the trees themselves. Olive oil was no longer a Greek product. It was becoming a Mediterranean system. Carthage turned olive cultivation into serious agricultural science. Its famous writer Mago produced a farming manual so valuable that when Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, the Roman Senate ordered the work translated into Latin. The city was burned. The agricultural knowledge was saved. That decision reveals how important olive oil had become. Rome was not interested only in conquering land. It wanted the techniques that made that land productive, and once Rome inherited those methods, olive oil would be pushed to a scale the ancient world had never seen before. Rome did not invent olive oil. It industrialized it. Roman writers such as Cato, Varro, and Columella described how to plant groves, manage harvests, press the fruit, and grade the finished oil. Different qualities were separated for different markets, with the finest oil coming from early pressings of green olives. For the first time, olive oil was being produced not just as a tradition, but as a standardized industry, built to serve an empire. At its height, Rome had around 1 million people, and olive oil touched almost every part of their lives. It was the main cooking fat. Romans rubbed it on their skin in bathhouses, burned it in lamps, used it in medicines and perfumes, poured it over altars, and issued it to soldiers as part of their rations. Keeping the city supplied required a vast imperial network stretching across the Mediterranean. Olive oil had become more than a commodity. For Rome, it was part of the infrastructure that kept everyday life running. Most of Rome's olive oil came from Baetica, in what is now southern Spain. Every year, ships carried enormous quantities of oil across the Mediterranean, up the Tiber, and into the warehouses of Rome. The scale was staggering. Tens of thousands of clay amphorae arrived constantly, each carrying roughly 70 liters. And when those jars were emptied, Rome faced an unusual problem. What do you do with millions of oil-soaked containers? Those empty amphorae could not simply be reused. The clay absorbed the oil, and the residue eventually turned rancid. So Rome created a dedicated dumping site beside the Tiber. Workers broke the jars, stacked the fragments in organized layers, and spread lime between them to control the smell. Over roughly 120 years, the pile became Monte Testaccio. At its peak, around 130,000 amphorae were added every year. The ordinary-looking hill from the beginning of this story was not random waste. It was the physical footprint of Rome's appetite for olive oil. Many of those amphorae carried painted labels known as tituli picti. They recorded details such as the oil's weight, producer, inspector, and place of origin. From these markings, modern researchers can reconstruct entire Roman trade networks. They also reveal something bigger. Much of the oil was imported for state distribution to civilians and soldiers. Olive oil was no longer just a product. In Rome, it had become a public utility. Olive oil also carried a different kind of power, sacred authority. In Judaism, it was used to fuel the menorah in the Temple of Jerusalem and to anoint kings such as Saul, David, and Solomon. Its meaning went far beyond food or trade. Oil became a symbol of divine blessing, legitimacy, and presence. That tradition would survive for centuries and pass into other faiths. By the end of antiquity, olive oil was no longer just helping cities function, it was helping people define what they considered holy. Christianity inherited this symbolism and expanded it. Olive oil was used to anoint priests, the sick, and those entering sacred roles. Even the word Christ comes from the Greek Christos, the Anointed One. The tradition continues today in Catholic and Orthodox ceremonies, where olive oil remains part of baptism, confirmation, ordination, and healing rites. A substance once traded by empires had become a symbol of divine blessing. In Islam, the olive carried the same sense of sacred importance. The Quran describes the olive tree as blessed, and Islamic tradition records the Prophet Muhammad encouraging people to eat olive oil and use it for anointing. Across the Muslim world, olive oil became part of everyday nourishment, healing practices, and religious life. By this point, one small fruit had crossed an extraordinary boundary. It was no longer only food, fuel, medicine, or trade. For millions of people, olive oil had become something sacred. By the end of antiquity, olive oil had become almost everything at once. It was food, lamp fuel, medicine, cosmetic, athletic preparation, trade commodity, religious sacrament, and even a tool of state power. Few products had touched so many parts of daily life. But that vast system depended on the empires and trade routes that sustained it. And when Rome fell, olive oil faced its next great test: survival. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the network that had carried olive oil across the Mediterranean began to fracture. Long-distance trade declined. Large estates broke apart. In parts of southern Europe, olive groves were neglected or abandoned. For centuries, Rome had turned olive oil into an organized system of production, transport, and distribution. Now that system was disappearing. The trees survived, but the knowledge and infrastructure around them were suddenly fragile. What kept the tradition alive was not another empire. It was a very different institution, the monastery. Across southern Europe, monasteries became unexpected guardians of the olive. Monks maintained groves because olive oil was essential for church lamps, religious ceremonies, and cooking during periods when animal fats were restricted. They also preserved older farming knowledge and sold surplus oil to nearby communities. As empires disappeared and trade networks shrank, monasteries kept both the trees and the techniques alive. Olive oil survived because someone kept using it. A second revival came with the Arab and Berber expansion across North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. In southern Spain, farmers improved irrigation, refined pruning methods, and expanded olive groves across Andalusia. They were building on land that had supplied Rome centuries earlier, but with new agricultural knowledge and techniques. Even the vocabulary survived. The Arabic term connected to the olive press entered Spanish and remained in use. When Christian kingdoms later retook the peninsula, they inherited not only the groves, but also the farming methods that kept them productive. Olive oil had survived another political transformation and was ready to travel even farther. The next leap came across the Atlantic. Spanish and Portuguese colonists carried olive trees into the Americas, planting them in places such as Peru, Chile, Mexico, and eventually California. In the 18th century, Franciscan missionaries planted olives at Spanish missions, including San Diego. One variety became known as the mission olive. After thousands of years around the Mediterranean, the tree had finally taken root on a new continent. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, olive oil was known far beyond the Mediterranean. but it was still mostly a regional product. In Northern Europe, the Americas, and much of Asia, people relied more heavily on butter, lard, or seed oils. Olive oil often remained expensive, unfamiliar, and limited to specialty shops or immigrant communities. The tree had crossed oceans, but its oil had not yet conquered everyday kitchens. That would change in the 20th century, not because of empire or religion, but because of science. In the late 1950s, science changed olive oil's image. The 7 countries study, led by Ansel Keys, compared diet and heart disease across several populations. Researchers found much lower rates of heart disease in parts of the Mediterranean, especially Crete and southern Italy. Their diets differed in many ways, but olive oil was the main source of fat. Over time, that finding helped transform the Mediterranean diet into a global health model, and olive oil into one of its defining ingredients. By the late 20th century, olive oil had become a truly global commodity. Demand surged across North America, Northern Europe, and Asia. New producers emerged in places such as Australia and California, and today, dozens of countries across 5 continents make olive oil. But production remains highly concentrated. Spain is still the global giant, producing roughly 4 out of every 10 liters in a strong harvest year, while Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Tunisia remain major producers. What began as a Mediterranean staple had become an international industry worth billions. That global success came with a weakness. In 2022 and 2023, severe drought and extreme heat hit major Mediterranean producers, especially Spain. Harvests collapsed, global supply tightened, and olive oil prices surged. Production later recovered, but the shock exposed a deeper problem. The world still depends heavily on a small number of countries. When Spain has a bad season, olive oil becomes more expensive almost everywhere. Climate is not the only modern problem. Olive oil also has a fraud problem. Products labeled extra virgin do not always meet the chemical or sensory standards for that grade. Some are lower quality oils sold under a premium label, while others may be blended or misrepresented. The irony is hard to miss. 2,000 years ago, Roman producers were already grading olive oil and marking amphorae with information about origin, weight, and inspection. Today, with far more advanced technology, proving what is really inside the bottle can still be difficult. Yet while markets rise and fall, some olive trees simply keep living. In Crete, Lebanon, Palestine, and Montenegro, ancient trees still produce fruit after thousands of years. Some have hollow trunks. Others have survived fire, drought, war, and neglect. One tree in Crete is estimated to be around 4,000 years old and still bears olives today. Civilizations disappeared around them. The trees remained. Think about what those trees have outlasted. Some were already ancient when the pyramids were rising. Others were alive before Rome, before Christianity, before the Ottoman Empire, and long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic. They survived wars, droughts, earthquakes, fires, and centuries of political change. Kings disappeared, empires collapsed, borders moved. The olive trees kept growing. And that endurance is not just poetic, it comes from the biology of the tree itself. One of the reasons olives have remained part of human life for thousands of years. Olive trees survive because they can keep growing even when their inner wood dies. Some become hollow, scarred, or burned, and still produce fruit. That endurance mirrors the story of the oil itself. The same substance pressed by Neolithic villagers was traded by Minoans. prized by Greeks, distributed by Rome, preserved by monks, and sold in supermarkets today. 8,000 years later, the product remains almost unchanged, and the story is still growing.